Still today, inside of the Tower of London, the bones and remains of one of Henry VIII's wives are buried. Anne Boleyn's remains were found in the 19th century during renovation works to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and what the Victorian doctors found was remarkable. Anne herself had a very tragic and sharp downfall at the hands of her husband and his closest adviser, Thomas Cromwell. She would be taken into the Tower and was accused of a number of scandalous charges, as the king got tired of the fact she could not provide him with a male heir and a successor in the form of a son. But Anne had divided England, and she was not the most popular woman across the nation. However, no one would have expected what happened to her, and no one would have anticipated that a French swordsman would take the head of a queen. But what was her imprisonment like inside of the Tower of London? In the past, a number of queens have been accused of treason or adultery. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine even tried to create uprising against her husband and the king, but these women were never ever punished with losing their lives, but they were just placed under house arrest. It was believed that kings and queens were sent by God to rule, but Henry VIII would not seem to bother about executing a queen anointed by God when he ordered Anne's downfall. He would accuse his wife of adultery with many other men, which obviously was shocking, and it meant the king was a cuckold. Having been cuckolded by men of lesser status than him, which was of course ruining the king's dignity. But this was of course not true, but the king did not seem to be bothered about this. In May of 1536, he was living the life of a party boy, and he would take musicians and courtiers down the river to meet with Jane Seymour. This time was recorded by Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, and he said, "Although the generality of people here are glad of the execution of the said concubine, still a few find fault and grumble at the manner in which the proceedings have had been conducted, and the condemnation of her and the rest, which is generally thought strange enough. People speak variously about the king, and certainly the slander will not cease when they hear of what passed and is passing between him and his new mistress, Jane Seymour. Already it sounds badly in the ears of the public that the king, after such ignominy and discredit at the concubine has brought on his head, should manifest more joy and pleasure now, since her arrest and trial, than he has ever done on the other occasions, for he daily goes out to dine here and then with ladies, and sometimes has remained with them till after midnight. But for the king to get what he wanted with Jane Seymour, he needed to get rid of Anne, and he did this by ordering Cromwell to create a plan, and he came up with a number of false charges. Anne Boleyn had been informed that she was a prisoner, and she would then be taken to the Tower of London. She arrived by barge and stepped out towards the fortress, and when she got there she was greeted by William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, the man in charge of her imprisonment. Kingston was warming, and he was courteous to Anne. However, Anne the Queen was now his prisoner. When she met Kingston, she said, "Master Kingston, shall I go into the dungeon?" But the constable replied that she would be kept inside of the same apartments she had stayed in before her coronation. It was then said that she began to weep at a great pace, and in the same sorrow fell into a great laughing, and she hath done many times since. Another Tudor chronicler wrote of Anne's arrival at the Tower that Anne Boleyn was brought to the Tower of London. Entering in, she fell down on her knees before the said lords, beseeching God to help her, as she was not guilty of her accusement. Kingston led Anne to her rooms, the royal apartments, and with her were a number of ladies who had been appointed to serve her. These were Mistress Coffin, Elizabeth Wood Boleyn, who was married to Anne's uncles, Lady Shelton, Lady Kingston, and Mistress Stonner. These women were in sense spies for Cromwell, and they were told to write down anything that Anne had said, and the king knew that he could then use this evidence against her. Anne would to her women at times in the Tower talk of a few minor flirtations that she had had with male courtiers, and these were then spun against her and taken out of context and were used against her. She would complain about how cruel her treatment was, but the ladies were told not to speak with Anne unless Lady Kingston was present, the wife of the constable, as he believed his wife was trustworthy. Her ladies would, though, sometimes taunt her, and Anne found out on the 5th of May, 1536, that her brother, George, was being housed in the Tower of London, and she was worried that he did not have a bed to sleep on. She was concerned about his treatment, and George and Anne were clearly close. She was, at the time, still the Queen of England, and Anne would silence her women and taunters with the fact she was queen and that she should be treated as such in her imprisonment. She forbid anyone to speak to them unless she spoke to them first. But for 2 weeks Anne was held inside of the apartments, and she did not know what was going on outside of the tower's walls. Kingston wrote that Anne said before her court appearance that, "And then she said, 'Mr. Kingston, shall I die without justice?' And I said, 'The poorest subject the king hath justice,' and therewith she laughed." Anne knew how brutal her husband could be in condemning people without any form of trial, but she had 13 days where she spent time worrying and praying, and she had nothing to do during her time, but the cogs were in motion, in which people were trying to distance themselves from Anne. Cromwell was gathering everything he needed to condemn and bring court proceedings against Anne, but inside the Tower of London's Great Hall there were wooden stands being made where Anne had her coronation feast years before, but this seating allowed for around 2,000 people to watch Anne's trial. A council had been gathered to try the Queen, and on the 11th of May they arrived at the royal apartments, and they had been told to get a confession from Anne. But the men were put off as Anne took control of the proceedings as she was queen, and this threw them off their plan. She then threw them out of the room, and they expected to find a broken woman, but she was not at all. On the evening of the 14th of May, Anne was told that in the morning her trial would begin, and she didn't think that her husband would go ahead with this, and she believed that he did not want all of the details of the charges being made public. But she thought that one day she would be sent to a convent where she would live out her final days. But Anne did not know that Henry VIII by this time had already sent word to France, and specifically Calais, to summon their executioner, the swordsman of Calais, to come to execute his wife, the Queen, long before she had been brought to trial. 2 days before, 4 men, also prisoners of the Tower, had been accused of adultery and treason with the Queen, and they were all condemned to death, and were then later executed at Tyburn. But on the 15th of May, Anne was brought to the Great Hall for her trial. The Lord High Steward, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk and uncle of Anne Boleyn, was presiding over the events, and Anne wore a black velvet gown and a scarlet petticoat and elaborate feathered cap. It was said she made an entry as though she were going to a great triumph. She presented herself with the true dignity of a queen and curtsied to her judges, looking round upon them all without any sign of fear. When the charges were read, she raised her hand and pleaded not guilty. There were no witnesses called, and there was no definitive action, and the protection constructed the charge of treason from the words Anne had spoken, and she was not given a defence. But the men of the trial took no mercy, and they condemned Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England and second wife of Henry VIII, to be burned at the stake or to be beheaded upon the decision of the king. It was said that Anne mentioned that, "I believe you have reasons upon which you have condemned me, but they must be other than those that have been produced in court. I've always been a faithful, loyal wife to the king." Anne, following her trial, was then taken back to the royal apartments inside the Tower of London, and she would never have guessed that her execution would actually then take place. She must have been gobsmacked that she had been condemned to death. But her brother George was then brought in front of the courtroom, accused of sleeping with his sister the Queen, and George defended himself and pled not guilty, but he was also found guilty and condemned. Anne would then be held inside the Tower of London for another few days until her execution took place on the 19th of May, 1536. She would probably have heard the carpenters making adjustments and amendments to the execution scaffold, and she would have heard them building these. The Sword of Calais, her executioner, may possibly have also been staying in rooms nearby to her after his arrival across from the English Channel. But her final days inside of the Tower were tragic, and no one could have predicted that the woman Henry VIII would seemingly want to move heaven and earth for would fall so sharply from grace. It showed the king's ruthless side. But still today, Anne Boleyn lies under the floor of the Tower's chapel, a a short walk from where she lost her head around 500 years ago. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.